Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. George Floyd, an American man, died recently. He was killed by somebody, a police officer, somebody who is in a position to protect all citizens, regardless of race, color, creed. And this police officer knelt on his neck. We've seen the footage, we've seen the pictures. And while the man pleaded, saying, "I can't breathe," the police officer continued to kneel on his neck until he was pronounced dead. I want to relay some words. These are not my own words today. I give full accreditation and due honor to Paul Scanlon, who's an international speaker, former pastor, and he put out something yesterday on his blog about institutional racism. This isn't something that I would usually tackle in a forum like this, but I think sometimes when we have the opportunity to say something, we need to say it. Institutional racism is when a belief system is institutional. It means it's embedded. It's implicit, it's hidden in plain sight. Why? Because it's part of the institution. And we have to understand that institutional racism does exist. It's actually written into the very institution of where the place is. I grew up in a country where institutional racism was just the way it was. The apartheid system was law, it was legal, it was okay to consider yourself privileged because of your skin color and to consider yourself to be a lesser individual, once again, because of your skin color. To ignore this is the definition of privilege. To ignore the fact that there is institutional racism is the definition of privilege. I have the privilege of ignoring that because it's probably never going to happen to me as an educated white person. I am this way because of opportunities that came my way. It was just the way of things. We are taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness and not in invisible systems conferring dominance on any group. As whites, we are taught about racism as something which puts others at a disadvantage, but we're not taught to see that white privilege actually puts us at an advantage if we look at the other side of it. And the way Paul Scanlon describes it, white privilege is like an invisible package of unearned assets. White privilege is like having an invisible, weightless backpack of special provisions, maps, passwords, code books, visas, passports, rights, freedoms, tools, and blank checks. There's a difference between earned strength and unearned advantage. I have to say that as I grew up in South Africa, I was living in unearned advantage. My parents lived in unearned advantage. Yes, they worked very hard, but they worked very hard at jobs that were easy for them to come by, whereas if they were people that were black and had not been given the same education or been given the opportunity to have the same education, they might not have been able to walk into their job that my father did. For instance, as soon as he left school, he went down to the local bank and was given a job. Would a black person have been able to do that under the circumstances in those days? Probably not. With Group Areas Acts, it might have been dangerous for that person to even venture out of their group area to go into a white area to apply for a job at a predominantly white-run institution. There's a difference between earned strength and unearned advantage. Now, people will go onto the flip side of this and they'll say, well, does that mean I must apologize for being white? No, let's not be silly, okay? We don't have to apologize for anything. We don't have to apologize for being white. But what we do need to do is recognize the fact that very often the privileges that come to us are actually there because we're white. It's easy for me to emigrate from South Africa to England. I came this way not because I was trying to escape anything. I came because I was given a job opportunity that we just thought would be good. Let's try something different. Let's try something new. We weren't running away from anything. We just decided to try an adventure. And it was easy for me to come over. I blended into society here very quickly. People remarked on my accent and told me how nice it was and everything like that. Yet I know of black people, because I run a church that is about 70% black, who have also come over here because of job opportunities. Many of them are highly educated people, professors, doctors, neuroscientists, biochemists, molecular biologists. I've had them, they're all in my church. but they're black, and yet they will be commented to. People will say to them, "Oh, I don't understand you when you talk. You speak with an accent." I speak with an accent, not as much as I did when I first got here. My accent has become slightly anglicized, but you see, people. When you're white, you just accept it in. When you're black, you have to fight your way through, and you have to deal with certain prejudices. And prejudice happens when there's that flickering thought in your mind, and I touched on this on one of my earlier talks called racism. Have a look at that video. Racism, institutional racism, is when you are walking down the road and a black person is walking towards you, and it's at night or whenever, and you immediately, for that split second thought, should I cross over the road? Is this going to be okay? Am I safe? Whereas you probably wouldn't think that if a white person was walking towards you. That's institutional racism. Institutional racism isn't about numbers of people who are racists. It's about a culture of avoidance and cover-up. It's about biased complaints, procedures, and weak disciplinary consequences for offenders. So these cops, they got fired. There were 4 of them. A few white cops got fired, but a black man died at their hand, or at their knee in this case. Isn't, if you're firing a few white cops, that's not justice, that's tokenism, that's a cover-up. That's an old boys club. No worry, we'll fire you. And I've known of cases like that where that has happened, and the people have been rehired a little while later once the heat has died down. Being fired is not being charged with murder or manslaughter. It's institutional rank closing and white privilege. That is what it is. Let's own that. Where does George Floyd's family now stand? What recourse do they have? They have to look at the situation. They've lost a loved one. What he was doing and all that sort of thing actually pales into insignificance when we look at the overt treatment. When we look at the over-the-top treatment that he received because of what he'd done. This is institutional racism. Does it exist in America? Well, yeah. Does it exist in other countries still? Yeah, it does. Where actually there's a cover-up culture. All right, and there's an automatic sense that because you're white, you're actually okay, and you probably should get the job, or you should probably get ahead. When a black person is struggling, it's assumed to be, well, that's what they do. But we're okay. People will then very often play this card, and they'll say, and there was actually a time in South Africa when transition was happening in rugby, and there was a black player that was included in the South African side, and people were saying, "Oh, it's tokenism" and everything like that. And there were, but then it was actually discovered he grew up in a very privileged black home, and he went to a private school and everything like that. And there were actually white members of the same rugby team, the national rugby team, who grew up in poverty. And people would say, "Oh, so who's the disadvantaged one?" Well, I tell you what, in South Africa, if you're that particular white person who grew up poorly in South Africa and grew up in poverty with a single mother, a certain rugby player, and they had to live in a one-room house or something like that. And you see, when you're white and you're poor, you still live in a house and sleep in a bed. When you're black and you're poor, you're lucky if you have a newspaper to pull over your body when you're sleeping on the pavement or in a field or under a bush. And I know this to be true because I've been there. I've lived in South Africa for 38 years, and I go back there every 2 years or so, and I see it. You see, and I know there are extremes, and I know there are white people that are struggling, and I know there are black people that are prospering. But I'm saying the way I see it, and you're welcome to comment on this. I don't say this with any hatred or malice or anger. I'm not an angry person. But I'm saying let's at least acknowledge it, that when a black person has got ahead, they've had to push through a lot of barriers to get there. When a white person has got ahead, well, it was kind of expected because he had connections. You see, when my parents pass away, I stand to inherit something. I know I have friends who are not white who have said to me, I've had to support all the way through my working life, I've had to support my parents. I stand to inherit nothing, maybe some of my parents' debt. When you succeed as a black person, it's because you've had to push through barriers. Succeeding as a white person very often comes because you know someone who knows someone. I got a very good job in a bank. I worked as a product consultant for the MasterCard division of a leading bank in South Africa, and I got that job because my father was a manager there. And I didn't have to go through any sort of process to get the job. I was phoned one day and said, listen, there's a job available. Are you interested? We spoke to your dad. Your dad says you're looking for something. Are you interested? That's white privilege, and I've lived in that. You see, the steakhouse restaurant I used to run, I was a part of a team of managers. I worked with the owner, and it was white privilege because it was in a white privileged neighborhood, and we'd had very few black clients because it wasn't in a black group area, so we had that privilege. And how did I get that job? Because I knew somebody who was already a manager there, and it was easily done through my little network of connections of employed people. If you know, it's white privilege. Let's just own it for what it is. We've got nothing to apologize for. All we're asking for is acknowledgement. Let's just acknowledge that it exists. And I thank Paul Scanlon for these words, and I give him full accreditation for the stuff that I read from his blog, where he also writes here, my heart goes out to George Floyd's family and the millions of George Floyds that suffer the same thing in America on a daily basis. But because it wasn't filmed, we don't know about it.